Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Peter Exodus O'Coffer here doing a new episode. Gonna go in a different direction with the channel. It's the history portion that I want to get into. Just uploaded today the classic songs "Let's Go Crazy" by Prince, and I love to, when I get really interested into something, to dive in and really look at the history and really take a deep dive. And interestingly enough, the history of popular music in America, and then from the mid 50s on is kind of, there's a lot out there, but it's not as much as you would think. So obviously you saw the title, The Rise and the Fall of Rock and Roll. A little misleading because certain aspects of rock and roll are very well, and the term fall of rock and roll is based on what you consider successful. And watched a documentary on YouTube with folks in heavy metal, and they're not complaining about the fact that radio's not playing current rock and roll. It's just classic rock and roll for the most part, and on oldie stations. So success is how you define it. Now, just to throw this out there, I'm doing a lot of different reading with artists and bits and pieces, watching YouTube videos and, on music history. But as a starting point, Ed Ward has two books, The History of Rock and Roll. Volume 1 is 1920 to 1963, and Volume 2 is 1964 to 1977. So I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos and reading a lot of different books, and so I will try to, when I get a chance to, if I remember, where I got this stuff from, to reference it. But the Ed Ward books are a good place to start. First off, there's been several strands of rock and roll, since the mid-50s. I call 50s rock the first generation, 60s rock the second generation. And, when folks talk about the rise and fall of rock and roll, they're really talking about the blues-based rock and roll. And in that second generation, the 60s were mainly the big blues folks were the Doors and the Stones. The other strand coming out is the Rockabilly strand of rock and roll, coming out of Elvis and Chuck Berry, and really going back into country. That's more the Beatles and the Stones, although they had blues influences as well. And going into the 70s, you had that mix of the rockabilly rock and roll and the blues rock and roll. And, by the mid-70s, that rockabilly kind of morphs into punk. And really, the roots of punk really come out of Detroit in the late 60s. You have the Stooges, which started off Beatle-esque, the first, album or maybe two albums, and then really got punk. And MC5 was really punk. But they were experimenting with punk, and really it was the Ramones and in the late 70s and the Sex Pistols that really lit the fuse for punk. Punk is actually doing pretty good. They're not getting radio play, but it's certainly a lot more vivacious and viable as a genre right now than classic rock. And classic rock, which is still really blues based, is struggling. And so, you have, in the 70s you have classic rock, and then the 80s you have hair metal, and then the 90s you have grunge. And then really you have a bunch of, what happens after grunge is rock becomes very fragmented. And you have all these different little subgenres, and that's probably led to some this decline of rock and roll, is this fragmentation of the genre. And so really now, I mean, you have, pop punk and punk, and then you have, I'm going to throw a lot of genres in here in general, but I'm going to, call this new breed of rock speed metal, because that is the goal is to be louder and faster. And there's a lot of subgenres in this speed rock. And honestly, I mean, it's not really my cup of tea, but I'm, not going to value judge people like it. Hey, I'm, no harm, no foul. And I like singing, there's the vocal fray, and, they're just doing a different thing, and it's a different generation, expressing itself. Now, interestingly enough, back in the day, in the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, the classic rock folks and the punk folks kind of did their own thing, and then the speed metal folks, did their own thing. But now, I mean, they have these huge music festivals where all three of them, what's left of classic rock and, the speed metal and the punk folks get together and, have these huge stages and play. And these bands make good money touring. Just because they're not on the radio doesn't mean they're not economically viable. And it's interesting, as I think I mentioned earlier, that, in the metal documentary I watched, and this probably was done in the last 5 years. First of all, these folks are, have no problem that rock is not the dominant music genre. Where actually they kind of like, standing out and doing their own thing. And as I said, I mean, it's a matter of perspective of what's struggling and what's, doing well. And they weren't complaining about the fact that, not everybody's listening to rock and metal and speed metal and whatnot. So I'm a sociology major, and got my undergrad in sociology from Purdue University, and my also got my master's degree in sociology. And so what we always do as a sociologist is we do a review of the literature out there. And two individuals on YouTube have kind of really, individually and with guests, in the case of the first person I will discuss, have looked extensively at the fall of rock and roll as the dominant genre. And the first I'm going to talk about is Rick Beato. Rick has produced a lot of albums, mostly rock guy. He plays everything: the drums, the keys, the bass, and the guitar. He did, have some hits, writing country hits, but so he's done a little bit of everything. He, mixes and masters in the studio. So he has a music appreciation channel, and he's big into music theory, so you can get all that. He does music lessons on his channel. He does a lot of stuff on his channel. He's a very good historian. He'll throw in jazz, he'll throw in classical music, but rock's his big thing. And so I mean, I'm going to look at him, and in a little bit I'll also discuss Finn McKenty. But Rick Beato, I have to say, I agree with the majority of what Rick Beato and Finn McKenty, say about the decline, at least, as the mega dollars of rock and roll, and the blues influence is struggling. And Rick Beato says the decline started in 1994. He says he calls the post-grunge stuff new metal, and he says it's not blues-based. Speed metal for the most part is not blues-based either. And as I said, punk is more out of rockabilly. Now, in the early, I want to say either the 90s or the 2000s, Fat Possum put out some alternative blues that everybody missed, and that has influenced punk. But for the most part, punk is coming out of the rockabilly tree of rock and not the blues. And he also talks about Rick Beato a lot. He talks about auto-tune and how that is not kind of a ephemera, or goes against the blues aesthetic, and how he always talks about the era of perfect music. You can go in and change the bad notes and change, if you sing flat, you can go in and change that, with these digital audio workstations. But everybody's doing that. The hip hop artists are doing it, the pop artists, and his argument is yeah, everybody's doing it, and it's changed music. Not for the better, but he's, Rick Beato's the kind, he makes the best of it and tries to find the good stuff that's still out there. And he also talks about how the Telecommunications Act of 1996, how that led to a contraction of the music industry, and the big labels bought up the little labels. Rick Beato argues that the last big rock star was Dave Grohl. I mean, he's probably right, on that. And he says, a lot of the guitar heroes gone, and that's for the most part true. Even grunge got away from the guitar solos, and one of the critiques of punk, they call, even classic rock, they call it corporate rock. And I think when they use the term corporate rock, although some of the punks hated Pink Floyd and considered them corporate rock from the 70s, I love Floyd. But, you could, even though I love Journey and Foreigner and REO Speedwagon and Styx, you could probably call that corporate rock. I like the stuff, but they did not like the stuff. They punk people said this formula, it went away from the rough and tumble roots of rock and roll. So Rick Beato also talks about folks are getting away, that rock and roll has stopped being cool. It's not cool. They've gotten away from playing musical instruments, and most genres have done that. And he argues that's one of the reasons why the kids are not into rock and roll as much. And rock and roll and music is competing with video games, for the attention of young folks. So, yeah. The other thing Rick Beato talks about this era of the faceless metal bands where you didn't know who the guys in the band were. And I think he talks about A Puddle of Mud and Disturbed. Yeah, that's definitely an issue. And then the whole thing of the post-grunge where rock became fragmented into all these little subgenres. I mean, I mentioned that earlier, but I probably got that from Rick Beato, looking at these notes from the stuff I took from Rick Beato. Let's see. So Rick Beato has where am I taking this from? The Decline of Rock and Roll is one of his episodes. Will rock music ever come back? That's another one of his episodes. And let me see here. Is rock music dead? So love watching Rick Beato. He's very interesting. I pretty much agree with everything he just said. So anyway, that's Rick Beato's take. On to Finn McKenty. And Finn McKenty has his podcast is called, I think it's Punk Rock MBA. Let me find that. Get it right. Yeah, the Punk Rock MBA, and he's actually, Finn McKenty actually comes from a marketing background. But yeah, so he, So his first argument, Finn McKenty, is that rock and roll is stuck in the past. Yeah. And pretty much every other genre is stuck in the past too. And I'll get I'm going to work on another episode that deals with all of that stuff. And he also argues, interesting enough, that the fan base of rock and roll is stuck in the past, and because all these rock festivals where all the money's made is dominated by these old legacy bands, and that's definitely the case. The rock press only writes about these old bands, and the people keep demanding these old bands. The other thing that he mentions, and is sort of in line of what Beato said, is that nobody wants to be a rock star anymore. And he said, and I alluded to this, and this is probably where I got this, is that, rock bands reject the mainstream pop culture. And this is going back to the folks where, rock fans aren't really complaining about the fact that rock is no longer the dominant, music genre out there. They're kind of revel in that. And so that's why, in some ways, I don't, the title of this, The Rise and the Fall of Rock and Roll, is a little misleading because, the consumers of this aren't like up in arms and complaining. Now, white baby boomers are complaining, and they're the main folks who, particularly with the death of blues, the blues rock and the classic rock genre, they're the ones who are complaining the loudest. But Finn, no new ideas. He also, Finn does offer some solutions. He said, solo acts are doing better, and they should focus more on solo acts, and I'll expand on that later. And Finn McKenty basically says the death of rock and roll happened on January 19th, 1993, when Nothing But a G Thing by Dr. Dre, that video, dropped. And he said, that's when rap became cool, and that's when, rap started taking over. And really, the hip-hop passed R&B as the the biggest selling African-American genre of music in about 88. And somewhere between 1998 and 2000, that is when hip-hop, passed the rock as far as being the top commercial genre. And he argues that hip-hop is cool because humans are drawn to dangerous people. It goes back to evolution. And that's still part of the brain. And people pay attention to dangerous people. And there's definitely something to that. And neither one of them touch on this, and I'll probably deal with it more later. But that's the problem with hair metal. Everybody wants to boomers blame the decline of classic rock on Nirvana and grunge. Which that's not fair. They critiqued, classic rock and I think made it better. And it was the last dominant form of rock. And in some ways they corrected for, some of the problems in classic rock. But hair metal, in the 80s certainly plays into that because hair metal was not dangerous. I mean, Motley Crue, their first two albums, they were dangerous. They, and I love Motley Crue, and I still love a lot of the songs from the hair metal era, but they weren't dangerous. Now, I don't consider Guns N' Roses a hair metal band. They were the last classic rock band, and there was definitely some danger involved with Guns N' Roses. I mean, Axl was kind of, could get on Hinge Live and do some stuff. Let's just put it that way. And so, Guns N' Roses was definitely the last Dangerous band. And, so Finn McKenty says rock was boring and lame compared to hip-hop. Okay? I can't really argue with that. Other folks, Gene Simmons is, touched on that of Kiss, big Kiss fan. Gene says, these young folks need to, put pretty women in bikinis and have lots of money in their videos. But hip-hop's already doing that. They've done that. They've cornered that market. Essentially, a couple videos ago, I touched on ZZ Top and how they moved into the MTV era, and hip-hop artists saw that and grabbed, putting the fine women in the videos. They weren't the only one. Motley Crue did it and others did it. David Lee Roth and his solo stuff. But, the hip-hop artists saw that, grabbed it, and ran with it and did a better job of it. The other thing, too, one of the grunge, even though I love grunge and Nirvana, two things: no Guitar Heroes. They cut back on these solos, as well as punk. That's coming out of punk. Punk was like, noodling and just, soloing for the sake of solos. But grunge wasn't really all that fun, and it wasn't really all that sexy. So even though I love grunge. Grunge's critique of classic rock in the 70s was basically Kurt Cobain's was sexist, and so they, grunge ended up being pretty, unsexy, and rock and roll's never been able to refine the sexiness. Machine Gun Kelly, start off rapper, now he's doing pop punk. He's kind of bringing some of that swagger and the sexiness back, and I find him intriguing. I haven't gotten through his whole catalog yet, so I can't really comment, but he's an intriguing figure because he brings a little bit of the rock and roll, the hip hop swagger in the rock and roll, and I guess he's had some feuds with metal bands, and the rock fans are pretty traditionalist, so they're not real happy with him. But we'll see where he goes as he brands, and I think his brand is the Journey right now. He doesn't have I'm not sure if he has a solid brand, but his brand is finding his brand, so to speak. But, Finn McKenty says, people like music that is fun, and rock and roll is not that fun. The other phenomenon Finn McKenty speaks to is the rise of the DJ and electronic dance music, EDM, as stars. So he also, that's another thing taken away from hip-hop, from rock. And then he delves into MGK as a whole, a little bit more, and his struggles, as he tries to move into pop punk and in that rock scene, and how beef is cool in hip-hop, but it's not cool in rock, and rock and roll is all about, respecting the tradition. So let me go back, and look at Finn McKenty and some of the episodes from him that I've drawn these notes from. Rock is Stuck in the Past. That's one of his episodes. The 3 Reasons Rock is Dying. MGK and the Sad State of Rock and Roll in 2020. That's another episode. The Exact Moment Rock Died, and that's where he talks about Nothing But a G Thing from, not Yeah, from Dr. Dre. Yeah. And why did rock stop being fun? That's where grunge comes. And he makes that. And then this is why everyone hates MGK. So he also has Punk and Metal Subgenres 101. So that's the background. I know it took a while to get there, but I wanted to, and everything I said that, Rick Beato and Finn McKenty have said, I actually agree with. I'm not going to argue with any of that stuff. But I'm going to take a little different tack now and talk about some of the, put on my hat as a sociology major and look at other factors. So the first question I want to ask is, we've heard the term over, many years, sex, drugs, and rock and roll was about rebelling. Well, what exactly was rock and roll rebelling against? Because jazz, the African-American form jazz, was about freedom and an oppressed group, using music to express freedom. The blues was focused on racism and economic exclusion, and really punk. The reason why punk has done well and continues to survive is I really call punk white blues, because it's kind of okay, you got your blues, we're gonna do our blues, and it really is. Similar, to black blues in some ways. So, classic rock and blues rock has always had a funny place in culture because, we thought it was rebellion, but it really, what was rebellious about it? I mean, it didn't, unlike blues, it does not critique dominant society or dominant institutions. As a matter of fact, Kiss and Aerosmith and AC/DC and Led Zeppelin, and love all those bands, particularly Kiss and Aerosmith. I mean, those are the first two albums I owned. But they upheld the system. They, for the most part, I mean, Aerosmith living on the edge, and they've done, they've done a few things, they ask, questions at times, but for the most part, they were just fine with the mainstream system and the culture. So what were they really rebelling against? And so my theory was, their place and why they fit in 70s and 80s and 90s culture was because, the Cold War. And I think in some ways, it was the East-West thing. So, hey, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you guys are repressed over there in Poland and Russia. And, hey, this is what we do in the West, and we're going to flaunt our freedom, and we are going to, to the point of decadence. So that's really that's where, I think, rock and roll, classic rock and roll and blues-based rock and roll, fit in the mix. Because, classic rock and roll and the blues rock and roll wasn't the real blues. It's interesting that folks are mainly Gene Simmons of Kiss, and I love Kiss, and Ted Nugent, when a rapper gets in, hip-hop artist gets into the Hall of Fame, you're like, well, this is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And my answer is always like, hip-hop is a hell of a lot more blues than anything y'all ever did. And it's interesting that, because really, I mean, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is all, the Beatles, all those folks. Elvis, I mean, Hound Dog was a blues. So even though he was rockabilly, all of them owe the blues. And so it really is, even though the blues has their own Hall of Fame, it is a tribute to the Blues Hall of Fame. And so hip hop artists belong in because of that. Unless you just want to, a Hall of Fame of relics. I mean, of the past. So yeah, going back, getting back on task here. So I really do think that, classic rock and blues rock was rooted in the Cold War and thrived because of that. And it thrived because of that culture and because if you look at when, the Berlin Wall fell in the early 90s, that coincided, that's when rock started eroding. And that's, almost the exact same time. That is when grunge came up and had that, and asked the questions that, classic rock and blues rock did not ask in the 70s and 80s, or hair band, the groups ask in the 80s. So, for a while, grunge filled that role. But once grunge, lost its steam, there was, what left was there, what appeal, because popular culture changed and the classic rock bands didn't change with it and didn't keep up. I mean, remember, that Russia was the big bad enemy until the early 90s. They are again. But, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin were buddies. I mean, they were, literally buddies, drinking together and whatever. And so, that kind of, the energy that, the classic rock and the blues rock fed off of kind of went away with the end of the Cold War. The other aspect that was happening in the 90s was the rise of pop country. Country was huge in the 90s. I think Garth Brooks is one of the biggest selling artists in history. I mean, and you had Garth Brooks, Tim McGraw, Shania Twain, Faith Hill in the Dixie Chicks, and they were huge sellers. And, I think what was going on, in the post, Cold War world, country, whether you like it or not, and I respect country. I love the storytelling and the lyrics in their songs, and, I'm a huge Johnny Cash fan. Willie Nelson, he's the dude. I'll be honest, I don't listen to country a lot, but I do respect it. But the 90s, the country was huge. But, I mean, the country is, comes out of folk music, European folk music. So it is a legitimate, European form of music. And it's always been the music of the white working class. Before rock was king, actually a lot of folks don't know this, jazz was king. And you had the big band era, and then which gave way in the late 40s to bebop. But folks in rural areas, the poor folks, white folks in the city, were not listening to jazz. Jazz was elitist. And, even going back to the 20s, the music of the white working class was country. That the same thing even now. But in the 90s, with country exploding and the fall of, and again, this is my sociological analysis of the 90s and classic rock and blues-based rock. I mean, it lost its focus. You lost, you had meaning when you had this, these two opposing forces of big bad Russia and Western capitalism. So once that was gone, I think a lot of the rock folks, they drifted over the country because, that was, and that, in the 90s, all of the genres were eating. R&B was exploding. Hip hop was huge. Country was huge. There were still a lot of big acts, even post grunge, that were doing very well in the 90s. Another interesting aspect of classic rock and blues rock is they never controlled the labels that, released their music. Yeah, the Beatles had Apple, but the Beatles did not own their music. Paul McCartney, I think it was, 2014, 2015, 2016, when he finally got the Beatles catalog back. And the Stones, most of their 60s work, they still don't own to this day. So it's interesting, the punk folks have their own labels. A lot of the hip hop folks learn the lesson and own their labels. But it's very strange and kind of weird that, the rock, acts never, owned their own labels. I don't know of them who owns their catalogs. But, hip hop kind of, took a different tact in that they, and part of it was because, they couldn't get folks to release the music and put it out. So they were forced to do their own labels. But I think it's very interesting that, the rock, acts, never really, took full ownership of their arts. Of their works like other genres have, and going forward. So, can rock and roll make a roaring comeback? I am skeptical. Now, the latest, a lot of folks, over the last 3 or 4 years have been intrigued with Greta Van Fleet. A lot of folks criticize them for being Led Zeppelin ripoffs, but actually this new album, their latest album, is amazing. It's a great album, and they are the one blues-based classic rock kind of band that is kicking behind. That label of, oh, they're just a Led Zeppelin cover group goes away with this new album. But it's gonna be tough for classic rock to find a foothold because first of all, and Finn McKenty touched on this. Remember, I said rock needs to focus on solo artists rather than groups, because it's always been, you watch the old VH1 and behind the music. A lot of these rock bands, you have the trio. At best, you have a trio of a drummer, bass, and guitarist, and oftentimes you have 6 members of the group, or 5 to 6 members. 2 guitarists, and a keyboardist at the outer limit, but usually at least 5 is usually the number. You got 5 egos. You got 5 folks that want their way as far as the song goes and wants to shine in every song. That's always tough. And that led to a lot of these, bands splitting up and the tensions and everything else. You don't have 5, people sitting usually, or you don't have to have 5 people sitting in the studio when making hip hop or even R&B. I mean, oftentimes it's a couple people at best. So that's the first thing, the egos. The second thing, I think, the importance of producers back in the day. You had Mutt Lange, you had, these great, who did Def Leppard, a lot, even George Martin with the Beatles. You had experienced producers that knew music theory and that could, had experience and could guide these bands, help them find the sound and kind of reach into the morass of the creativity mess sometimes that and pull out some good stuff and be like, this works, that works, and settle the arguments in advance sometimes too. No, that solo's too long, or yada yada yada. So the producers were very integral to the dominance of blues and classic rock, and that's just not the economic model does not allow for that anymore with streaming. The money's not there. Rock isn't generating the money to do that, so labels aren't going to do that. The other thing, this is the biggest hindrance, is great music is built on great songwriting, and all the great ones, Kiss, Aerosmith, all they wrote their own stuff in the 70s, but by the 80s and certainly into the 90s, they were bringing in songwriters to help them as the taste, the music for the fan base changed. Songwriters aren't going to write rock anymore. I mean, there's just no money to be made in that. Back in the old model, the pre-Napster days, I mean, songwriters make their money off of airplay, whether it's radio, Sirius XM. That's where they're back in the day, MTV. That's where their money's made. The old economic model was, the writers make the money off of the radio, and the artists make it off of record sales and touring. Well, record sales is gone. Not a handful of folks make money off of streaming. But the old breakdown as far as songs went, as far as the revenue generated from radio, half of that money went to the labels. The other half was split between the person who wrote the lyrics and the person who did composition, meaning came up with the actual music. Sometimes it was one and the same, and sometimes it was multiple people, and sometimes it was in the band itself. So that was the breakdown. Rock isn't getting radio play anymore, so you're not going to attract outside songwriters. So if you're a rock band now, you better learn how to write music, and and it's not easy. It's not easy. Rock and roll is probably the hardest genre when it comes to writing because, hip hop is very stripped down coming out of James Brown. And there's a lot of, I'm going to do a hip hop podcast, so we'll get into more on hip hop later. But James Brown had a big influence. Hip hop is very stripped down. James stripped the music down, and hip hop, for the most part, is still very stripped down and still heavily leans on, James Brown and how he did music. Drake has changed the game somewhat and brought in, the Motown and Beatles and Elvis pop hooks. But for the most part, and the other advantage that, hip hop has is, they use a lot of synthesizers and, going beyond hooks, setting the mood of a song, and synthesizers are a lot cheaper than they were back in the day in the late 80s when I started making music, and you get a lot more patches or the sounds, whether it's bass or strings or whatever, and they can make a lot of different the timbre and the tone. So it's a lot easier to find a patch that will set a mood for a song. Rock and roll heavily relies on the guitar, and there's only so much you can do with the guitar. So, so when I listen to the classic rock, this new generation of classic rock, I mean, where they really fall short, I think, is in rhythm guitar. And back in the day, I used to be that guy. Pete Townsend and Keith Richards. I mean, they're not. Everybody talks about they're good guitarists, but what solos did they do? And it wasn't. It took me writing songs with guitars until I really learned the value of rhythm guitar. And rhythm, the basis of rock and roll is the rhythm guitar. It's where the hook is, where you're going to find a hook, and it's also what sets the mood, and that's really what's kind of missing, I think, is the hook and setting the mood. And so you need to know some theory, or you better have a really good ear, like Kurt Cobain or or something. Because you really, punk is different because you can do 3-4 chords, and the use of chords in punk is different than in blues and classic rock. So, in punk, the chords are to drive the song and the aggression of the song, and that with the gnarly, nasty, rumbling bass. In blues, in classic rock genre, the bass, is usually well down in the mix, unless you're, Gene Simmons of Kiss or Nikki Sixx, who's basically, owns the rights and is the dude for Motley Crue. But, you have to, a lot is asked of the rhythm guitarist and or lead guitarist in the rock band. You do the job of the synthesizer, and you really, if you don't have a producer there to help you anymore, who's produced 20 or 30, or 40, whatever, rock albums and understands the theory. So that's one of the really impediments for rock and roll music coming back. The other, and my fifth point is, rock tradition. No synthesizers for the most part. Rush used synthesizers, in the mid 80s on, Queen used synthesizers. I mean, that helps because you can set some interesting moods with synthesizer patches and not even based on theory. Whatever, you can just play whatever and set a nice tone and a nice mood of the song that way. And the other thing too is, no drum machines. And, the bugaboo of music for years is finding a good drummer. It seems simple. I know there's a lot of drummers there who are really fancy, they can play Moby Dick by, Led Zeppelin, John Bonham, or, you see them on there and they're doing Funky Drummer, Clyde Stubblefield from James Brown. But can they keep a beat? Can they keep a rhythm? That ultimately is the job of a drummer, is to keep time. And it's not as easy as you would think. You can go on YouTube and, type in band members pissed off at their drummer, and, there's whole collages of kicking drums over and, band members jumping in front of other band members because the drummer's not very good. And I don't care who the guitarist, you can have Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page, you can have them both on this stage and, take your favorite rock singer of all time and, put John Paul Jones or Neil Peart of Rush on bass. If the drummer's not good, the band ain't going to be good. So that's a huge impediment because there's always been a shortage of drummers. And Rick Beato, I can't remember what episode, when he was a producer, and he said there were times when literally, session drummers were on all, 20, 30, 40 rock albums a year, because, it was just that hard trying to find a good drummer. And my first album, I remember I was leaving, the sound engineer, I was leaving, when we were mixing, he had a band coming in, and he just shook his head. He's like, man, love these guys, Rock Band is coming in. And he's like, but, I'm going to be here 2 or 3 hours afterwards, doing autocorrect for this drummer. So, it's a problem. It's a problem for rock. I mean, there's a lot of impediments, for the rise of rock and in this new economic landscape and this new economic model for music. It's going to be tough, for rock, the blues-based rock to rise up again. Another aspect, you listen to, you go watch, look at this week's Billboard Top 100 or last week's or last year's or 5 years ago, there are no guitars, for the most part on Top 40 radio anymore. So that's another aspect of what's going on is, and it's the hip hop influence, because hip hop really never bought into the guitar. To put on my sociology hat again and talk about another impediment, that is the generational divide, going on in white America between white boomers and millennials and white Gen Z, because they, white folks under 40 they don't seem to miss, classic rock very much. And we know that there's a huge, cultural war going on there. And I think that colors, the younger folks wanting to, embrace the music of their parents, because part of, every generation when they're young is like, oh gosh, my parents' music sucks. And then of course the parents are like, oh gosh, my kids' music suck. But eventually, you talk to artists and you're like, hey, my parents used to play that, and now it's, as I got older, it made its way into my music. But that's not really happening. That generational divide is real. It's affecting the vitality of the rock and the classic blues. And again, I'm talking, a lot of this stuff I'm talking is kind of cultural and social norms that's going on here. The whites under 40 are, cognizant of the history of race and rock and roll. The Brits were very good at, loudly proclaiming their love of black music and influence. The Rolling Stones, saved a lot of blues careers in the 70s and 80s, because they had their blues idols open for them. And when they when they touched down in New York City in I don't know, 64, 65 was when they first came to America. They touched down in New York and jumped on another plane to Chicago to go to Chess Records so they could meet, their blues heroes. But when they took them around on tour, they didn't take them in the U.S. They took them around in Europe, and because the blues was always a lot more popular with white Europeans than black Europeans. And of course, then there's MTV and Michael Jackson with Thriller, broke the color barrier with MTV, and so. A lot of people remember that. A lot of black artists remember that, and the history's there. And then I think white Gen Z and millennials know that as well. So there's that history that just won't go away. And again, even Aerosmith and somebody walked this way with Run DMC and Living on the Edge and play Mother Popcorn by James Brown for years. Their first album had a lot of blues. Honkin' at Bobo. In the 2000s, they did, blues covers. So Aerosmith's another one, where, race relations was always very important. So I'm not going to really put this on as much on the artists. There's not a whole lot of, blatant racism and coming out in the music of classic rock and the blues-based rock, more, and but the other factor is it was almost impossible for, black rock acts to break. Living Colour broke. They didn't know what to do with, in the 80s and the 90s with Fishbone, and Fishbone was a great band that came up. They're similar to No Doubt and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They both have admitted that, Fishbone was every bit as good as them, but they just could not, record companies didn't know what to do with them. And so I put, a lot of the racism on the record companies. But, going back to, these bands never started their own labels, and they never really controlled their own destiny. It's very ironic that, these bands made a hell of a lot of money for these record companies and for themselves. And, a lot of these folks are doing very well financially, but they never took ownership of their of the machine, so to speak. So is there any hope for blues-based rock and roll? The one thing that blues-based rock and roll does well, along with R&B, and R&B is kind of struggling too, but all genres are very straitjacketed right now. But the one good thing that blues-based rock and roll does, along with R&B, is they're very good at expressing the broad spectrum of human emotion. Hip-hop is dance, gritty, party, and anger. I mean, those. I mean, let's just be real. Those are the emotions that they. And when hip hop deals with sexuality, it ain't. I think for younger folks it's romantic, but it's not Al Green. It ain't Teddy Pendergrass. It ain't Marvin Gaye. Punk is again aggressive, angry. And it deals with relationships, in a pop punk sense. But it ain't sexy either. With rock, I mean, you can get angry, you can be uplifting like Creed or epic like, Stairway to Heaven. The power ballads like, Home Sweet Home by Motley Crue or November Rain by Guns N' Roses. I mean, the whole spectrum is open. And the same with R&B. I mean, the Isley Brothers, Fight the Powers That Be, Who's That Lady? I mean, that's funky, but then you have Between the Sheets and For the Love of You. And then you have their cover of Ohio, talking about the anti-war protests. So these are the two genres, R&B and rock that really can, are flexible, can, really get the whole aspect of the human experience on like, speed metal, the topics. I mean, you're not going to, candlelight and wine to some speed metal, and you're not candlelight and wine to hip hop drill. I mean, I'm just saying, but classic, rock and R&B have the ability to stretch and to cover all of these human emotions. So that's the avenue I think that's available. I agree with Finn, Finn McKenty, focus on individuals. And it's hard, for both of the, to do that now. And I put that squarely on record labels. I'm going to do, does 2022, does today's music suck? And then to say no, because there's still good music out there. But it's hard because, in the post-Napster era, if you want to make, how these record companies, like the brand is very narrow, and they really have the screws and have the straitjacket on all of these new artists about, stretching out and doing different things musically. Now, could hip hop, and could punk, cover the spectrum like classic rock, blues rock, and R&B? Maybe, but the record labels aren't letting them do it. So that's the positive. I've been researching this, been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm glad I finally got this down. More of this is coming. I'm going to do, we got a one on funk coming up, and then I'm doing hip hop. But this is a big topic. Everybody has their opinions. Certain segments of society are hand wringing, like, why don't they like my music? And and it's complicated why, classic rock and blues rock is declined and is, my argument is, for the most part, genres don't die. I mean, jazz is long gone from, by, the early 50s was no longer the dominant music genre, but it's still very, vibrant. If you go look at, you listen to 21st century jazz, that's the, one of the Spotify playlists. And I think they have another one, all new jazz. Jazz, I mean, these young folks, under 40 are doing great jazz stuff right now. And even the blues. I mean, ironically, if you want to find the blues, you might have to go and actually listen to the blues. The blues hasn't disappeared. I mean, you have Joe Bonamassa, you got Samantha Fish, you got Keb Mo, you got Taj Mahal, obviously you still got Robert Cray. There's still a lot of good blues folks out there doing the traditional blues. Now it's not rock and roll. I mean, it's the, it has the traditional structure, and rock, borrowed from that structure, but went in a different and really, I mean, the song structure, I mean, the architects of that were, going back, I mentioned earlier, the great songwriters on guitar, Keith Richards and Mick wrote with the Mick Jagger and Pete Townsend, who, really was the sole songwriter for The Who. And they did the hard work as far as songwriting, and a lot of the band, the classic rock and blues rock really built on what they did. But yeah, so trying to end it here on a positive note, we still got Greta Van Fleet, and I think, other bands will break through, but it's not easy. Structurally, I mean, all of the different aspects, in the pre-Napster model that was there to help these bands along, are not there anymore, and they're not coming back. And, if I'm a 23-year-old kid today, this is another aspect, and I'll touch on. Why would I learn drums? Nobody's playing, none of the songs on the radio are playing guitar. I could, buy a drum machine app on my iPad for $10, buy a Groovebox, app on my, iPad for $20 and start making music and rapping. That's just the word. I mean, and rap was built, by poor kids who couldn't afford instruments and rapping over other songs and scratching and with DJs. And I mean, it was rap is about talking about the history of black folks in slavery and coming out of slavery, and chitlins and grits and making food out of the gumbo, making food out of the parts of the cow and the pig that nobody else would eat. And rap is kind of built on that same concept of bare bones. Let me try to figure out how to make some music here on the cheap. And rock, punk was built on that same ethos. I mean, punk has gotten a lot, the musicianship has gotten a lot better over the years, but that early punk, a lot of cheap, 4-track recorders, and I owned one, back in the late 80s as well. So, punk and rap, hip hop share some of the same DNA and came up under similar circumstances. So, yeah, that's my take on the state of classic rock and blues rock. I think it will stick around to some aspect. The question is how much and how many folks will be able to break through and really, catch folks' imagination. And because of all the genres that have risen and fallen, it's the one that's struggling the hardest. And part of that is, cultural shifting in many ways, the generational divide, losing the anchor of the Cold War and things like that. So, yep, got hip hop coming up, got funk coming up, and doing more classic songs as well. So, see you next time. Oh, hey, gotta say, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, check out my 4 albums. I have them here on YouTube, and I'm also on all the streaming channels. So thank you for your time, and I will see you next episode.